Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we try to cut through the noise and get straight to the insights that really matter. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really big energy question facing, well, everyone, but especially the U.S., the future of liquefied natural gas exports. LNG. Now, you've probably heard about the temporary pause on approving new LNG export projects that started back in January 2024. It was a pretty significant move. So what we're going to do today is unpack this brand new, really comprehensive report from the U.S. Department of Energy, the DOE. It basically tries to clarify what continued LNG exports could mean for the U.S. economy, for energy prices right here, for you, and even for global emissions. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding a really complex, often pretty hotly debated issue. We've got the DOE report, other sources too. And our mission is just to make sense of it all.
And what's really fascinating here, just to set the stage a bit, is how incredibly fast U.S. LNG exports took off. I mean, it went from almost nothing to being a global leader. Just look at the last decade. It's been, well, a meteoric rise. To give you some numbers, back in 2015, the U.S. exported, 0.078 BCFD? That's billion cubic feet per day. Tiny. By the end of 2023, it was 12 BCFD.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a 153 times increase. It pushed the U.S. to become the world's top LNG exporter in 2024, ahead of places like Australia, Qatar. And growth like that, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's already had a huge economic impact. We're talking $408 billion added to U.S. GDP, supporting around 273,000 American jobs. So this temporary pause announced earlier, it wasn't just some minor bureaucratic thing. It was a response to some pretty serious concerns. The analysis they were using to approve exports, it was last updated in 2018.
Which is ancient history in the energy world.
Exactly. And there were big questions about impacts they hadn't fully assessed, like what does this do to energy costs for regular Americans? What about the full greenhouse gas footprint? And even things like health impacts on communities near the terminals. Plus, questions about future global demand for gas. Maybe it wouldn't be quite as strong as people thought. So this new DOE study, the full title is Energy, Economic, and Environmental Assessment of U.S. LNG Exports. It was specifically designed to fill those gaps, give us a more current picture.
That context is crucial. Okay, so this DOE study, it's pretty detailed. It looked at 14 different scenarios, which honestly could make your head spin. But for our deep dive today, we're going to keep it simpler. We'll focus on two main scenarios that really show the different paths forward. First, there's one the report calls Define Policies Existing FID Export. DPXID for short. Let's maybe call this the pause maintained scenario, just for clarity.
Right. That's the baseline. It assumes current climate policies stick around. And crucially, exports are limited, only from facilities already running or the ones that had a final investment decision FID by the end of 2023.
Okay, so under this one, exports kind of level off.
Yeah, they plateau around 23.6 BCFD, billion cubic feet per day, by 2035 and stay there through 2050. It's basically holding things where they are, more or less.
Got it. Then the alternative scenario. Define policies, model resolved, or DPMM, we can call this the pause lifted scenario.
Makes sense.
This one also assumes current climate policies, but, and this is the key difference, it lets U.S. LNG exports grow based on economics, market forces, global demand, how competitive the U.S. is.
Essentially, let the market decide how much we export.
Exactly. So for you listening, this is really about understanding the difference. Do we keep exports relatively stable, or do we let them grow significantly based on the market? It's a choice with potentially huge consequences. All right, so we have these two paths mapped out. What's the first really big takeaway from comparing them? For me, it's just the sheer difference in the volume of LNG we might export. Under that pause-lifted scenario, the DPMR one, U.S. LNG exports could hit an incredible 56.3 BCFD by 2050.
56.3 BCFD.
Yeah, and just to put that number in context, that's more than double the 23.6 BCFD projected if we stick with the pause-maintained levels.
That's a massive difference.
It really is. And it's not just a number. It reflects the potential for the U.S. to meet a really big chunk of the world's future natural gas demand, assuming we can do it competitively.
Okay, but that kind of volume increase immediately brings up a critical question.
Domestic price.
Exactly. How do those much higher export levels affect prices for us here at home? For regular households, for American businesses. The study looks closely at this. Let's start with Henry Hub spot gas prices. That's the main U.S. benchmark, right? Tells you the wholesale gas price.
Right.
Under the pause-lifted scenario, the DPMR prices are projected to rise to about $4.62 per MMBtu by 2050. MMBtu is the energy unit, millions of British thermal units. That compares to $3.53 per MMBtu if exports are constrained under the pause-maintained scenario. So yeah, an increase. But, and this is important context, while $4.62 is higher, the report notes these projected prices wouldn't necessarily be outside recent historical
Oh,
experience.
wait, so we've seen prices like that before.
We have. Henry Hub averaged $4.37 per MMBtu back in 2010 and again in 2014. So it's an increase compared to the constrained case, but maybe not panic territories historically speaking.
What about for actual consumers, like homeowners?
For residential users, the projection is around $12.80 per MMBtu by 2050 in that higher export scenario. That's about 4% higher than if exports were constrained.
Okay, 4%.
But for industrial consumers, it's a bigger jump. They could face prices around $5.13 per MMBtu, which is about 18% higher than under the pause-maintained levels.
18% is more significant for businesses.
Definitely. And one other thing, these price impacts wouldn't be even across the map. The Gulf Coast states, being close to all the export terminals, would likely see the biggest price increases.
Right, makes sense. So a clear trade-off there. More exports potentially mean somewhat higher domestic costs, especially for industry in certain regions. That regional point is key. Okay, let's shift from the energy market to the wider economy.
Yeah.
GDP, jobs, because the numbers here, well, they look pretty substantial.
Right.
The study projects that those higher LNG exports, the pause-lifted scenario, would boost U.S. GDP by an extra $80 billion by 2050 compared to keeping exports constrained.
$80 billion a year by 2050.
Yeah. I mean, $80 billion sounds like a lot, maybe put it in perspective. It's roughly the annual GDP of, say, Luxembourg. It's a 0.19% increase in our national GDP, which, over time, adds up. And just to add more context, we saw another source, an S&P study, that projected something even bigger cumulatively. They estimated $1.05 trillion more GDP between 2025 and 2040, with increased LNG exports versus restrictions.
Wow, over $1 trillion. That's a huge potential economic lever.
It really frames the scale. And beyond GDP, industrial output is projected to grow by an extra $203 billion in 2050 with higher exports, mostly in oil and gas extraction. And what's striking is this happens even with those higher industrial gas prices we just talked about.
Right. It shows the strength of the demand and the overall economic benefit outweighing the higher input cost, at least in this model. And it's not just abstract GDP numbers. Think about jobs and government revenue. The U.S. National Association of Manufacturers, for example, they project that high LNG exports could support over 900,000 jobs and generate $48 billion in government revenue by 2044. That's almost double the revenue compared to the constrained scenario, right?
Right.
About $27 billion.
Exactly. Nearly double. These are significant benefits for workers and for public finances. But we also have to acknowledge the flip side, especially at the local level. While more natural gas production boosts local jobs and revenues, which is great, it can also put a strain on local infrastructure, roads, schools, water systems in those communities seeing rapid growth. It's a boom, but one that needs careful planning and management.
That's a really important point about managing the boom. Okay, let's tackle the environment. Greenhouse gas emissions, CO2. This is always central to the debate, and the findings here are, well, pretty interesting. Let's start domestically. Within the U.S., how do emissions change?
Okay, so domestically, U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions do increase slightly under the higher export pause-lifted scenario compared to the constrained one. We're talking about a marginal increase, just 0.7% higher by 2050.
So not a huge jump domestically.
Relatively small. And importantly, both scenarios actually show overall declines in U.S. CO2 emissions between 2030 and 2050. It's just that the decline is slightly steeper if exports are constrained. Okay, so that's the U.S. picture. But what about globally? This is where it gets really fascinating. The study finds that the additional U.S. LNG exports contribute, again, marginally to total global GHG emissions. They estimate an addition of about 711 MMT CO2e by 2050.
MMT, millions of metric tons of CO2 equivalent.
Correct. And 711 sounds like a lot, but compared to total projected global emissions, it works out to a tiny increase, just 0.05% globally. But here's the finding that really stands out, the one that challenges some assumptions. It's about the GHG emissions per unit of LNG exported, per BCFD.
Oh, okay.
What the report finds is, under the pause-lifted scenario, the one with more exports, the associated global GHG emissions are 0.86 GTCO2e for every 1 BCFD of LNG exported by 2050. GT is gigatons, so a billion metric tons.
Right, 0.86 GT per BCFD with higher exports.
Compare that to the pause-maintained scenario where exports are frozen. In that case, the emissions intensity is 2.06 GTCO2e for every 1 BCFD of LNG export.
Wait, so the emissions per unit are significantly lower when we export more LNG. That sounds backwards.
It does sound counterintuitive, absolutely. This is the crucial nuance.
Can you help us understand why that would be? How does exporting more gas lead to lower emissions intensity globally?
Yeah, it's a really important point. The modeling suggests it's about fuel switching, primarily in other countries. Think about rapidly growing economies, particularly in Asia. If they don't have access to relatively cleaner U.S. natural gas,
They might burn more coal.
exactly, they'd likely rely more heavily on coal for power generation and industry, and coal is much, much more carbon intensive than natural gas. So by providing LNG, the U.S. essentially helps displace dirtier coal consumption elsewhere.
Ah, okay.
So while our domestic emissions might tick up slightly from producing and liquefying the gas, the global effect is less emissions overall compared to a world where that U.S. gas stays home and coal use stays higher abroad.
So it acts like a bridge fuel, reducing emissions globally, even if not domestically.
That's the core idea suggested by this modeling. It reframes the environmental impact. It's not just about U.S. borders, it's about the global energy mix and how U.S. supply influences that mix.
That's a really fascinating perspective. Definitely changes how you might think about the environmental piece.
Yeah.
Okay, beyond economics and environment, the report also touches on energy security, geopolitics, national strategy stuff. And one key finding seems to be reassurance. The U.S. has enough gas. The study confirms we can effectively meet both domestic needs and export demand in all the scenarios they looked at.
Right. Even with much higher exports, the models show sufficient domestic supply.
So what does that capability mean in the bigger picture?
Well, it positions the U.S. to use LNG exports as a tool for significant geopolitical influence.
More than just selling a product.
Much more. Think about allies in Europe or Asia looking to reduce their dependence on energy from, let's say, less reliable or potentially hostile suppliers.
Like Russia, for example.
Precisely. U.S. LNG becomes a really important alternative, a source of energy security for them. It strengthens alliances, provides leverage, it's economic statecraft.
And the report specifically mentions Asia-Pacific as dominating LNG imports by 2050.
Yes, that region is projected to be the major demand center. So U.S. presence there through LNG could be strategically very important. It's about influence, stability, partnerships. So let's try to wrap up the core findings and these inherent trade-offs. This DOE study, it paints a pretty clear, though complex picture. On one side, allowing higher U.S. LNG exports points towards, significant GDP growth, more jobs, big economic pluses.
Right. The $80 billion GDP boost, maybe over $1 trillion cumulatively, 900,000 jobs.
Yeah, those are compelling numbers. But on the other side, there are costs. Marginally higher domestic gas prices, hitting industry harder, especially in the Gulf, and a slight uptick in U.S. CO2 emissions. However, and this is probably the most debated and maybe surprising part, the global GHG impact per unit of LNG exported looks lower when the U.S. exports more. That suggests, potentially, a constructive role for U.S. gas and global decarbonization. Displacing coal is complicated.
Very complicated.
And then there's the undeniable geopolitical angle, using LNG to bolster energy security for allies and enhance U.S. influence globally. It's all interconnected.
Absolutely. And this deep dive into the DOE report, it really gives us a much clearer view of what's actually at stake here. It's interesting. Our source material mentions explicitly that there's a high expectation that incoming President Trump would unfreeze the pause on LNG exports, aligning with political promises. And as we've just discussed, this latest DOE study certainly provides arguments that could be used to support doing just that.
Right, the potential for higher GDP, more industrial output.
Exactly. Plus that nuanced environmental case about lower global emissions intensity per unit, the energy security benefits, the geopolitical leverage. It's all in there. So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given everything we've unpacked from this report, balancing that promise of economic prosperity against the reality of slightly higher domestic energy costs, and factoring in that really complex, nuanced global environmental picture, how do you think policymakers should navigate the future of U.S. LNG exports? It's clearly not a simple decision, and it has ripples that spread across the globe, affecting everything from, well, our wallets to international relations. Understanding these details, not just the headlines, is definitely the crucial first step. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.